that the first true bloodshed of the American Revolution wasn't the Boston Massacre. It was the Battle of Golden Hill, right here in New York City, January 1770.
Welcome everyone to New York City. Today we're going to explore the early days of the American Revolution with an amazing tour guide, Karen Quiñones, who is Mrs. Q. We are currently located in downtown Manhattan, the financial district, right in front of St. Paul's Chapel. And Karen is one of my favorite tour guides in all of New York City because she knows everything that is to know about the American Revolution, especially here in New York City. So we're going to take a trip down to the 1700s here in Great New York. I'm Ariel with Urbanist, and this is Karen Quiñones, who is Mrs. Q.
Hello, Mr. Vieira.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking me back in time.
Thank you for joining me today.
And tell me a little bit, who are you, Mrs. Q?
Mrs. Q is my reenactor character, or called a living history character, who I play here in New York and in other areas. And Mrs. Q is a lady who lives during the Revolutionary War period. She is a merchant here in New York City. She has inherited her shop from her father, and she and her husband, Mr. Q, work around where Hanover Square is, which is still Hanover Square today.
Oh, cool.
And she, of course, is what we would call a Whig or a Patriot, meaning she was one of those people who was against the king and for the war. And since she is a merchant, she is very well connected with the gentlemen in the Sons of Liberty, who we'll be talking about today.
Interesting. The Sons of Liberty got into some trouble.
They certainly did, and
we're
we'll
gonna
be
get
talking
into
about
that.
them today and what happens.
And let me show you the costume before we start walking
Yes.
around. So actually, before, situate us. Where are we in New York City? And what time are we going to?
We're going to say that this is January of 1770. And we're standing in front of St. Paul's Chapel, which is the same church that was here in 1770. It was built in 1766, and it was the country chapel for the Church of England. It was the country chapel because if we look in this direction, which is all traffic leading up to Midtown today, we would just see country there. So we might see some farms and some country homes. This is a dirt country lane Broadway at that time, or the Broadway as they called it, because it was the widest street in the colonial town. To our south is the entire city of New York. So where you see the end of the buildings on our left is the end of the town. And that is all of colonial New York City.
That was it.
So we'll see quite a bit of it today. It was only 3/4 of a mile long and half a mile wide.
And your costume, wow.
Yes, I know people always like to hear about how ladies dressed at the time. So this is my outfit for 1770s. And I have on my nice little red shoes and my shoe buckles. Shoe buckles were very important at the time. You know, when a young lady accepted a proposal of marriage from a young gentleman, his next job was to buy her the most elegant pair of shoe buckles that he could afford. So the shoe buckles were very important as a gift. And of course, as I have been married for a long time, these are later buckles that Mr. Q has given me as a gift. But when we were first betrothed, he gave me my first set of shoe buckles. I have on a number of petticoats. So you see I have on a pink petticoat. I have on some wool tights. My pink petticoat, my outer skirt. Beneath all of this, I have on a linen dress or chemise, which is right next to my skin. Over that is what you see here, the pink petticoat, and over that are my stays, that garment you're used to seeing that laces up the front or the back. And that holds everything into this nice conical shape that's popular in the 1770s. Over that is my scarf and my quilted winter jacket to keep me warm.
Wonderful. So this is winter wear.
This is winter wear. I do have a quilted skirt as well, but it's not that cold today, so I didn't wear it. I just wore my silk skirt and my linen skirt beneath it. And this is a typical marketing type hat that the ladies wore out at the time. And the hairdo with the big hair and the little ponytail is also 1770s accurate. And the white scarf.
And a little bit of rouge as well.
Yes, the little pink rouge on the side.
Wonderful. Oh, I absolutely love the costume. I give it up to Karen Quiñones for this amazing costume. I'm so excited for this tour. Let me know if you're excited for this tour.
And I have to tell you that this costume does give new meaning to the phrase, it is better to look good than to feel good. Because you cannot bend in the stays, you can only bend directly at your waist.
Yeah.
So if I were to drop something, a gentleman would have to be up, as there isn't any way that I can reach the ground in this clothes.
Hence the age-old flirting techniques that women used to do when trying to find a suitor.
Yes.
All right, so let's get on with the tour.
So our story today begins right up here by St. Paul's Chapel, where we have a park over here that today we call City Hall Park. At that time, that was the town commons, and it was just a big empty field. There was a military barracks there, and our friends in the Sons of Liberty, and I say that quietly because no lady would ever say their name in public. The Sons of Liberty or the SOL or Liberty Boys would often meet there, right on that triangle across from us.
Oh, I see.
And when they met on the commons, of course, they then got into all kinds of mischief around the town, from dragging loyalists around on the commons to try to make them damn the king, and stringing them up on the seat of their pants by something called the Liberty Pole.
Oh.
And we had a series of Liberty poles on the commons. We had a series of them.
Let me zoom in on this.
65 through 1776. They were put up often to commemorate our differences with the crown. So some of you might remember something called the Stamp Act, and that we eventually influenced the Parliament and the King to repeal the Stamp Act, the tax on paper. Well, when that was repealed, the very first Liberty Pole was placed on the commons. The soldiers at that time felt that that was an insult to the king, so they tore it down. So the Sons of Liberty came up and they put up another pole, and the soldiers tore it down. Well, by January of 1770, we are on our fourth Liberty Pole on the commons, and this one has an iron grid reinforcing it around the bottom so that no one can cut it down anymore. Now, that's successful until tonight is the anniversary, January 16th, 1770. In the morning of January 17th at around 3 a.m., the soldiers came out. They stuffed the bottom of the Liberty Pole. They put holes in it, stuffed it with gunpowder, attached a fuse, blew it up, cut it into pieces, and piled the pieces up in front of Mrs. Montaigne's Tavern, which would just be right up here on the Broadway.
And these were, sorry to interrupt, were these military men?
These were British soldiers.
These were British
that were
soldiers.
based here in New York.
Oh, wow.
They piled up the pieces, blocking Mrs. Montaigne's, because Mrs. Montaigne's was a favorite place for the Sons of Liberty to spend their time.
Yeah.
And from there, the battle was on between the soldiers and the Sons of Liberty. And this conflict resulted in what we are going to go visit, the site of the Battle of Golden Hill.
Uh-oh. Ooh, I'm so excited to learn about this. I'm a huge fan and student of American history, and I never really heard of Battle of Golden Hill, so I'm so excited.
Well, that is because, of course, you know, our friends in Boston have been very good at promoting themselves.
Right.
So that New York tend to have been left behind, and that we did not promote ourselves as well as our good friends in Boston. But then again, we all know that everything that is best in all of the colonies comes from New York.
Right. That's true.
Boston is still somewhat of a backwards provincial outpost, where we know the finest food,
Provincial.
the finest
That is
food,
quite an insult.
the finest food, the best clothing, the best entertainment, and fashion are all found in the city of New York and the city of Philadelphia. Boston still being a backwater. I believe in the current time, many New Yorkers would still say Boston.
Well, it was also quite literally, because it was also built on a swamp. So.
Well, you know, the song Yankee Doodle comes from the British soldiers singing about how backwards the people of Boston were. A Yankee Doodle is a Yankee, so someone from New England. A doodle is a backwards farmer sort of person. So Yankee Doodle would be your average New England farmer. So Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. He goes to Boston on his horse, stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Now, macaroni at that time was a term for the finest dressed gentleman, dressed in the most haute couture of the time.
Oh, I
so
see.
they're making fun of them, saying that, well, they just put a feather in their cap, and they think that's everything.
All right.
So
right.
Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat, and called it macaroni. So they were making fun of how backwards they were.
Oh, I see. So he, like, Yankee Doodle thought he was,
Oh, so well
as we would
dressed.
say, the S here
Yes.
in New York City.
And let's take a left.
Oh, let's do it.
And as we cross Broadway, remembering this is a wide dirt lane,
Mm-hmm.
and we look to the right, on our right, we see one last building on the right with the sun peeking out behind it.
Yes.
And that is the end of our town.
Wow. It's
So
so,
from here to there is the whole length of the city of New York. Behind that building would be Fort George and the harbor.
oh, I see.
Now, most
And-
of the people are living in this part of the Broadway where we're headed next.
And there was really nothing west of us.
No. Let's see. If we go over here, I think we can see the Oculus from here.
Yeah, we can peek into it. Yeah, right here.
Well, right behind the Oculus is the Hudson River.
Yeah.
So that's all landfill from behind the Oculus. So it's only from here to behind the Oculus on the Hudson River side. And in a few minutes, we'll see how close we are to the East River as well. Now, this is John Street, and we notice the street signs now as we walk will all be black in color.
And they have little photos with them as well.
And that tells us we are on original colonial streets, streets laid before the American Revolution.
It's actually just briefly across the street here,
Yes.
and we'll go show this photo to set up the scene as well.
And you'll notice immediately that the streets are going to get very narrow and they'll twist and turn. They were all laid out in a way that was convenient for the time.
Alexandra asks, how much does a costume weigh?
It's actually very light.
Like, oh, interesting.
It's very light. The fabrics are very light and they're very natural. It's all cottons and linens and the silk. And the fabric next to your body is either linen or cotton. So in a way, the costume or the clothing they wore at the time was more natural and more comfortable than the synthetic fabrics that we wear today.
Oh, I see. And here is about 150
Oh my
years
gosh.
after Mrs. Q.
Yes.
Yeah, so here we see Broadway back in around the late 1800s, early 1900s. Early 1900s because of all
All
the
the
cars.
gentlemen out, right?
Yeah.
All the financial gentlemen out in the street.
There we go.
So you could imagine that we're walking along here, and the street is just full of ladies and gentlemen that are nicely dressed. I do have to say that we will be walking much further today than a lady of Mrs. Q's time would actually walk herself. But the ladies, because of their types of shoes and their clothing, generally took carriages the distance we'll be walking today.
I see. Oh, that's amazing. And then just give thanks to Swisser and Agnes. Thank you so much for the stars and the super chat. I appreciate you. And consider, do you have a tip link? Do you have a tip link?
What do you mean?
Tips. Okay, just consider.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yes. You can go to paypal.me/Patriot Tours.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
PayPal.me/Patriot
Patriot Tours.
If someone could put the link
Thank
down,
you.
that would be so appreciated. So back then, how high were the buildings?
Oh, they would have only been 1 or 2 stories high. Oh, and by the way, while we're here, across the street would have been the John Street Theater, the most high-end theater in all of colonial New York City.
There's a
Where-
plaque somewhere
There
there.
is
I
a-
remember
there is
seeing
a
it.
plaque.
Yeah,
I think it's over here.
yeah, close to Layall.
Yes, for the John Street Theater. And visiting theater companies would come from Europe and from England and perform here. And it was set back about 30 feet from the street and had an awning that went all the way back so that if you got out of your carriage in poor weather, you would be protected as you walked from your carriage to the theater and your clothes wouldn't get snowy or wet as you walked. It was also a custom in New York that many families had their servants go sit in their seats before the show started to reserve their seats for them. And then when they came, their servants would return home. It was kind of a bizarre.
Well, it's like the modern day person who waits in line for a Kona.
Yes.
And they're paid.
See, so nothing really is new, is it?
Right.
So we're walking along John Street, and we're walking east toward the East River. And this would be the most heavily residential part of colonial New York City. All of these little streets filled with inns and taverns and shops and homes. And look at this. If you've never been down here, you start to see now just how much these streets all twist and turn.
Yes,
and how narrow they are. Enough for two carriages to pass. And we go downhill. This is a nice view. Downhill and back up.
Which we'll see a little bit later. And for anyone tuning in, Karen might not be wearing a mask is because we're pretty far away from people. It's very empty on the Saturday. And I'm, of course, maintaining my distance as much as possible and I'm wearing a mask as well. So that's why. Of course, she's the tour guide, so we need to hear her to maximum extent.
I do have a little bag here for when we're free. So we're coming up now on a lovely landmark, John Street Methodist Church.
Oh, beautiful.
And this church
wedged in these two skyscrapers.
This is one of these wonderful things about New York City, right? Where you see something that dates to the 1760s right next to an enormous, ugly monstrosity. So one of the things we learned to love about New York.
Exactly.
And this is not the original church building. This is the third church to be built on this site.
Oh, I see.
But we have a mural on the other side that will show us what it looks like here in the 1770s.
And let me show you here a little bit across the street. You can stay there.
This building is from 1841. And I mentioned it's the third church built on this site.
Has a very interesting look to it, very square.
Yeah, this is very mid-19th century looking.
Oh, I see.
And the original church that was here looks quite different. And will also give us an idea of the neighborhood.
And time-lapse, Mrs. Q actually does have a wireless microphone. I'm using a dual wireless setup. That's why I can walk all the way far away. And you can talk at a normal level.
How clever is that? At such distance. Right here on the wall we have a mural. So now let's pretend that this is where we're standing right now on this dirt road in front of that white wall next to the blue-gray building. And that blue-gray building would be where this church stands today. So we're here, maybe where those gentlemen are standing talking and someone has their dogs out. And this is residential John Street. And you can see a number of different building styles. Some look English and some look Dutch because, of course, we were a Dutch colony first. So there's still some Dutch influence in New York City at the time. And this church actually has a rather amusing origin story. And that is that the woman who founded the church, Mrs. Embry, was distraught that there was not a Methodist church yet in New York City. And her cousin was a Methodist preacher. And she kept asking him to come to New York to start a church, and he wasn't interested. But he did plan a visit to her. So she arranged to have a number of people in her kitchen playing cards when he arrived. And he was just so upset at the depravity of New York that people were playing cards in the kitchen that he immediately decided that yes, they needed a Methodist congregation, and the congregation was formed here by Philip Embry and Barbara Heck. and
I see.
remains here today. It is the oldest continuous practicing Methodist church in America. And the statue in back is of John Wesley, who some of you might know was the founder of Methodism and brought it to
Zoom in.
so beautiful,
Interesting.
little hidden away historic site that you might just walk by and miss if you weren't paying attention.
It's very easy to miss.
If you're looking down at your text messages, you might walk right by and miss it.
I first realized this maybe about 4 years ago. Being a lifelong New Yorker, I was like, oh, wow.
Fine.
First Methodist church, interesting.
And it's also interesting down here, people probably can't see that up there above us, it's very sunny. While down here on the street, because of the size of the buildings, it's quite dark. But up above us, the sun is shining quite nicely now.
It is, yeah.
So up
Beautiful.
there, it's a sunny day.
Wonderful. And here's a historical photo of the
Here's a photo
church.
of John Street.
Oh.
The gentleman in the photo is Peter Williams. And Peter Williams was a slave here in New York. New York City, unfortunately, had the highest ratio of slaves to free population of any city north of Virginia. And that is largely because New York merchants engaged in the slave trade. Most of the slaves here were domestic servants, and Mr. Williams attended this church with his family. His family were loyalists, meaning, of course, they were loyal to King George III. And when hostilities broke out in New York, they planned to leave New York. And they put him up for sale.
Oh,
The
fascinating.
vestrymen here at the church and the elders were so upset that a member of their church was placed for sale that they bought him. They granted him his freedom, and they gave him a job as the sexton of the church so that he could support himself and his family. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, he said the war brought him two great things: his own freedom from domestic bondage and the freedom of his homeland from foreign invaders. He then attended college, he became an ordained minister, and he opened the first all-African church in New York, the Mother Zion Methodist Episcopal Church, which would be in Chinatown today, or the Five Points as it was called then. So Peter Williams, the first African pastor in New York to have his own church. His son Peter Williams Jr. went on to be a highly educated gentleman and was a member of the New York Manumission Society. He was a friend of Frederick Douglass, and he wrote many articles. He also published a journal during the Civil War. I believe it was called Freedom's Journal, and that the articles were all written by freed slaves who resided in New York at that time. So Peter Williams, I believe, could be considered a founding father of the city of New York.
Right. And also, there's a strong Methodist tradition within the African American community right now.
Coming from that, I think.
Yeah, interesting.
Yes.
Fascinating.
So that would have been the first church that free Africans in New York would have had of their own. New York had a very complex social system at that time. We, of course, had African slaves, and we had free Africans, one of whom was a founder of the New York Sons of Liberty. He was a merchant and ship captain. We had free Scots and free Irish, and we also had those who were indentured servants, as well as Dutch who were free and Dutch who were indentured servants as well. So it was a much more complex type of society, I think, than is easy for us to understand today, although it made, perfect sense to them at the time. Remember, in the 1770s, the idea of all people being free and having the right to participate in their governance was completely unknown anywhere
Right.
in the world.
And it's fascinating how African Americans had such a big impact in the revolution. That's not so well covered in the
Well, as
textbooks.
soldiers, absolutely. And if you notice, we're on a hill. And this
We
is
are,
kind of
yeah.
yucky because of the scaffolding. So let's cross the street because we
Sure.
are now at the top of Golden Hill.
Oh, this is the Golden Hill. Interesting.
Oh, and the view is beautiful.
It is. Oh my God, all the different array of buildings.
It's a beautiful
Wow.
view from here.
So, is there any homage to the name Golden Hill, as far as you know, in this area?
Yes, apparently. The people who lived up here
Yeah.
grew some type of flower that was golden in color. So they simply began referring to the neighborhood as Golden Hill. So although New York City was so tiny, all of the little neighborhoods had names. So up here is Golden Hill, and in a little while we're going to talk about at the bottom of the hill to the left of where you see the Federal Reserve, that's that very castle-like building there, was an area called the Fly Market, which was simply an open-air marketplace called the Fly Market.
Oh, I see.
So this is the top of Golden Hill. Now, after that fourth Liberty Pole was blown up by the Sons of Liberty,
Yeah.
a broadside came out. Now, a broadside was an article. It was like a blog post. So it was the colonial version of a blog. You wrote your opinion, you took it to a printer, they printed large copies, and you pasted them up all over town. And of course, you wrote it with a pseudonym because you didn't want anyone to know you wrote it. And you put them up around the town. People would stand around and they would read, of course, what you had to say. So after the Liberty Pole was blown up, a broadside appeared around New York, authored by a gentleman who called himself Brutus, and it was brutally critical of the soldiers. He said, why should we pay taxes to support these soldiers who destroy public property, get drunk, drink, carouse? They're a threat to the peace, safety, and liberty of all the good people of this town. And a few days later, another one came out, written by the soldiers themselves. And they said, God and a soldier, all men do adore. In time of war, but not before. When war is over and all things righted, God is forgotten, the soldier slighted. And they went on to say, we're not a threat to this town. The true threat is that drunken mob called Sons of Liberty. And as I mentioned before, no proper lady would ever say the word. And in the broadside, Sons of Liberty is not spelled out. It's S-L- because it was a phrase you would not say in proper company. This drunken mob, the Sons of Liberty, whose identity is based on a wooden pole stuck in the ground they worship as an idol. And a few soldiers were putting it up right there at the base of the hill by the Fly Market. And at that time, two leaders of the New York Sons of Liberty, Mr. Isaac Sears, whom people feared so much they called him King Sears. He was a seaman and a rough and tumble guy. And his friend, Wouter Quackenbus, both members of the Sons of Liberty.
Quite names that they have.
What names, right? Mr. Quackenbus, I assume, was Dutch. Saw them putting up the poster, and they stopped the soldiers and confronted them about it. And they each grabbed a soldier. Well, at that time, a third soldier pulled out his bayonet to protect his fellow soldiers when Mr. Sears, for some reason carrying a ram's horn, bonked the soldier in the head with the ram's horn, and a massive brawl began down there at the base of the hill.
Oh no.
Eventually, they grabbed the soldiers, they went off to the mayor's house and asked the mayor to please negotiate some sort of armistice, which worked for a time. But after they left the mayor's house and they were making their way up the hill, by now the crowd had grown to about 20 soldiers and at least that many local men as well. When they got to the top of the hill, they said that one of the soldiers yelled out, take your swords and cut them to pieces. And that they looked at the men and said, where are your Sons of Liberty now? And they started hacking away at the people in the crowd, who then grabbed sticks and clubs and whatever they could find to defend themselves. They said one gentleman even grabbed a halberd, and I don't know if in today's language we know what that is. That is a long tool. It looks like a long stick, and it has a scythe at one end and an axe at the other end. It's a farm tool.
Yeah.
One gentleman grabbed a scythe, a halberd, stood in his doorway and defended himself. This went on all night, dissipated, and then started up again the next morning. And the newspaper account tells us that one lady was on her way home from the Fly Market. So she was walking up this hill, carrying a package of fish she'd just purchased, and that a soldier was harassing her and put his bayonet through her clothing, but between her quilting and her cloak and everything, he didn't touch her body. The bayonet only went through her clothes. And that some gentleman escorted her home, but as the door was closing, he was still attempting to bayonet through the door. Another gentleman was cut across the face and lost a number of teeth from a bayonet, and witnesses said he only survived because he kind of scooched into his doorway where the bayonet couldn't really reach him that well. It went on for 2 full days, and we call it the Battle of Golden Hill.
Oh, wow.
The first all-out armed battle between residents and soldiers. Now, this was January 18th and 19th of 1770. And you might know the Boston Massacre was not until March 5th.
Oh, interesting.
5 weeks later. Therefore, we in New York say the Battle of Golden Hill is the first true bloodshed of the American Revolution.
It's the real inciting
It is the
incident.
real inciting incident. You forget
Fascinating.
that backwoods, event in Boston. Although our friends in Boston have responded by saying, well, of course, no one was killed at Golden Hill. But we say to them, you didn't say the first death of the Revolutionary War. You said the first bloodshed, and blood was certainly shed here at Golden Hill.
And did this get any press? And let's move over here.
Yes,
did this
it
get
did.
any
It
press?
did.
Because the reason we all know about Boston is because of Paul Revere, the
wonderful engraving.
great showman in a way.
Yes. Showing us even then that people tend to believe what they see rather than what really happened. One of the greatest pieces of propaganda in Revolutionary War history, Paul Revere's engraving.
So Golden Hill didn't have that.
No. New York did not promote it that much, although, fellow groups of Sons of Liberty talked about it, and certainly the newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston talked about it, but it definitely did not have the hype. The Boston gentlemen really were masters at hype.
Oh, I see.
We would call it hype today. Particularly those two brothers you've heard of called cousins, I should say, the Adams cousins, right? Were very good at hype.
And were these residents trained military men before? Like, did they have a past in military?
Some of the gentlemen in Golden Hill probably had some experience in the French and Indian War.
I see.
And some of them, if they were sailors, obviously, knew how to defend themselves. Others were just farmers and dock workers and gentlemen from the city who worked in the city.
It goes to show that the stereotype of the pitchfork is actually a real thing.
It kind of is.
Instead of a pitchfork,
is.
it was a halberd.
Yes, yeah, the idea of fighting with those, right? Chasing a mob with one of those.
Fascinating.
Now, I think some of our friends viewing today might also be familiar with a gentleman in the Sons of Liberty by the name of Hercules Mulligan.
Oh,
Right?
wait.
Hercules Mulligan, quite a troublemaker. and
Hercules
rabble-rouser.
Mulligan from the amazing musical Hamilton.
right.
Wait, he's real?
He is certainly real, Mr. Hercules Mulligan.
He's not a rapper? What?
No, a fellow merchant.
Okay.
A fellow merchant and gentleman.
Callie, thank you so much for the $10 super chat. Appreciate you.
And member of the New York Sons of Liberty.
Yeah.
And his shop was right near here.
Oh, interesting.
So shall we go visit
Let's
the site
go.
of Hercules Mulligan's shop?
I mean, I could use a new jacket, so let's go.
A fellow member of the New York City Chamber of Commerce. The New York City Chamber of Commerce has been with us since 1768.
Yeah.
And of course, Mrs. Q, I am a member, as is Mr. Mulligan.
Oh, wonderful.
And another great leader of the Sons of Liberty, Mr. Alexander McDougal, if you know McDougal Street in the village, named for Captain McDougal. Another member of the Sons of Liberty who, while the Battle of Golden Hill was going on, was in jail not far from here for a broadside he issued saying that the current assembly in New York was elected through vote fraud, was completely corrupt. And calling out the names of all of the people involved in the corruption, which got him put in jail. Because, of course, this is before the free press. So,
Oh, I see.
it's before the Constitution. So, in colonial New York, when you criticized, or any of the colonies, when you criticized an appointee of the crown, you often wound up in jail for seditious libel, as Captain McDougal did.
Ellen asked, what street are we walking on
We are
right now?
on Platt Street.
Platt?
And so we know...
Interesting name.
and Gold Street here. And there was a major brewery here on Gold
This way.
Street to our right. It's over here. Which was very important as there was no drinkable well water in New York at that time. So everyone was drinking fermented beverages,
I see.
which may account, and rum, which may of course account for all of the brawls we had. So we have Gold Street, and you see how these little streets are through here. And we know simply from looking up the address of Mulligan's place that he was at Platt in Queen Street. So when we look on our map today, if you go on Google Maps, you won't find a Queen Street
There's
today.
no Queen, yeah.
But you will find a Pearl Street.
Oh,
And Pearl
interesting.
Street
Yeah.
was Queen Street, so his shop was right over there.
Oh, let's go. And
Mr. Mulligan was a graduate of King's College. Who else was a graduate of King's College?
Alexander Hamilton.
Of course, and it was the Mulligan brothers who helped Mr. Hamilton gain entry to King's College and who also helped him make his way to New York. Hercules Mulligan's older brother hired young Hamilton in his shop in the Caribbean and helped him come to New York.
Oh, fascinating. I didn't know they knew each other in the Caribbean.
Yes.
And that's the islands of St. Nevis and
Yes.
and St. Kitts.
Yes, I think he hired him on St. Kitts. And it was the Mulligan brothers who assisted Hamilton in his desire to come to New York and helped him gain entry to King's College, as they were graduates of King's College as well. So you see, some of the members of the Sons of Liberty were fine gentlemen, as Hercules Mulligan was.
So let me pause you there. Alexander asked a great question.
Yes.
Hercules Mulligan, being such a famous tailor in town, who was he servicing in terms of families? Was there a very influential family
Yes,
here?
and I'll tell you a bit about
Okay.
who Hercules Mulligan's customers were.
Perfect. Alexander, thank you so much for the super chat. There's so much history here to learn, says Irevis.
There is so much layer upon layer upon layer.
And Eugene, are you a historian or tour guide? What do you consider yourself?
I am a historian, and
Okay.
I have written a book about Aaron Burr's daughter, Theodosia Burr. It's called Theodosia Burr.
The link is in the description below here on YouTube. I'll put it on Facebook afterwards.
Thank you. And it is a young adult biography of Theodosia Burr. It's full of original prints, textiles of the time, because although I know Hamilton fans are not fans of Aaron Burr was unique in that he was the only gentleman of the time who believed women should be educated equally to men, and set out to have his young daughter educated equally to the influential boys of her time. So Theodosia Burr is the first fully educated woman of her time, educated to the standard of a gentleman. And the book is the story of her life and what it was like to be an unusual teenage girl who wasn't, she didn't learn to do embroidery or sew or any of those things. She learned philosophy and geography and literature. She read Latin and Greek, and so she was quite an odd young woman, and it was about what it was like to be different, and it's also about what New York was like at that time, right after the Constitution was ratified, and we were really finding our way as a new American city.
So check out Theodosia Burr, and also you appear in a few television shows.
I am in about 30 episodes of
30?
Mysteries
Oh, wow.
at the Museum.
I didn't realize it was that many. That's awesome.
Which isn't airing anymore.
Okay.
But it's in reruns everywhere. So I'm in about 30 episodes of Mysteries at the Museum. A very fun show that talks about historic artifacts. And whenever an artifact came up that fit my time period of history, they would call me. And I've done all kinds of interesting segments on that show. And of course, every Thursday night you can see Mrs. Q live.
Yes.
On Patriot Tours NYC on Facebook. So every Thursday night you can see Mrs. Q live, where Mrs. Q invites you into her home and talks about a subject from the American Revolution.
But this is not the end, because we're just beginning. This was just to show you how badass Karen Quiñones / Mrs. Q is. Now, let's continue with the story. Let me know if you have any questions whatsoever.
Please ask. The questions are wonderful, and no questions are dumb. Questions are wonderful. We learn by asking questions, so please ask them. So
Cool.
we are at
Awesome.
Pearl Street. Now, everyone, my teacher used to say, put on your thinking cap or put on your imagination cap, because Mr. Vieira is standing at the edge of the East River.
Whoa.
And maybe
Am I drowning right now?
Maybe there's a little bit of water up to his ankles here.
Okay, good.
And this is the way Pearl Street obtained its name.
Fascinating.
So Pearl Street is the original shore of the East River on the east side of Lower Manhattan. And this was filled with oyster beds. And you can see the street twists and turns because it follows the original shore. And when those Dutch settlers arrived, they said that the pearl shells, the oyster shells, looked like pearls glistening in the sun. So they called the little, waterside road here Pearl Street. When the British arrived, they renamed it Queen Street. So from 1664 until about 1785, it's going to be called Queen Street during that British colonial period, and then the name will be turned back to its original Pearl Street. So we know from looking up Mr. Mulligan's address in the New York directory, and they did publish directories at that time similar to what we would have called our yellow pages.
Fascinating.
With everyone's residential listing and business listing with their address and how to find them. So we find out that Mr. Mulligan was at the corner of Pearl and Platt, or Queen and Platt. So when we see this new hotel, would have been the store and home of Mr. Hercules Mulligan.
And how many people were living in New York City at that time? It's
About
great question by Marco.
25,000.
Yeah.
It was second in population to Philadelphia, and then Boston was third. Although Philadelphia was a bigger city, but New York was a wealthier city because of all of the commerce here.
Hercules had quite a big access to customers.
He had a wonderful shop here, and when we look at newspapers, we can see ads for his shop.
Yeah.
And we can see ads for fabrics he sold in his shop. So Mr. Mulligan and I both import fabrics from Europe and from India and from Britain, and we also buy locally woven fabrics. Now, Mr. Mulligan would only make men's clothes, as tailors only made clothes for men. Ladies went to dressmakers or mantua makers. So we did not have the same people making our clothes. So ladies might buy fabric from me, Mrs. Q, and take it to their mantua maker to have their clothing made.
I see.
A gentleman would buy fabric and take it to his tailor to have it made, or perhaps buy the fabric at his tailor. Either way. So we go to different people to have our clothes made. So Mr. Mulligan would have all gentlemen in his shop, and they would be rather well-off gentlemen. So the merchant class in New York, or perhaps the British officers, who you might know come from the aristocracy of England. The commoners are the regular soldiers, but the officers all come from the aristocracy. So they might be here getting their clothes made as well. Mulligan is known in his store to offer refreshments for his customers, some of the finest pastries available in the town, as well as port wine and Madeira wine and tea and coffee while the gentlemen are being fitted.
Oh, that's great service.
Wonderful service. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen an old movie called The Scarlet Pimpernel, about a gentleman rescuing people from the guillotine in France during the French Revolution. And there is a scene in there where they're all in a gentleman's tailor shop, and they're sitting in the chairs and they're lounging and they're drinking tea or they're drinking wine, and one gentleman is standing and he's having his arm measured for his sleeves, and then he's having his cravat tied. So that would be very much the environment we might see in Mr. Mulligan's. Very relaxed environment with the gentlemen being fitted for their clothes.
And in the musical Hamilton, they depict Hercules Mulligan as being stylish himself.
Very stylish.
Was the real Hercules stylish as well? He was no Sam Adams?
No. Hercules Mulligan and Alexander McDougall were both known for their, what can I say it, cutting edge attire of the time, or most fashionable attire. So they were both rather I want to say peacocky dressers, both of them, yes, as would have been many of the men who went to Mulligan's. Now, you might know, Hercules Mulligan was a leader and member of the Sons of Liberty, and we see his name on documents everywhere. So he was friendly with the gentleman who caused Golden Hill, Mr. Isaac Sears, and all the rest of them. But we find that during the Revolutionary War, he is living in New York City under British occupation. How would that happen?
Yeah, how did you get away with that?
Well,
especially being associated with like Alexander Hamilton and many other people.
And everyone knew he was. Well, Mulligan claimed to switch sides. He put up his hand. He swore an oath. He took the offer of amnesty from the British. He swore an oath of loyalty to the king, renovated his shop, hired 3 excellent tailors, and now became tailor to the British gentlemen living in New York during the war and the top-ranking British officers. And I bet some of our audience knows what he was also doing. Does anyone else know what he was doing?
Oh yes,
He
this
was up
is
to something else. What else was he doing?
I
Does
think-
anyone know?
I think Hercules was the original James Bond, at least in terms of American standards.
Mr. Mulligan was an associate of the Coker spy ring.
Ooh.
That famous spy ring that operated in New York City and Nantucket, Long Island during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
And while he was in his shop, he would listen to the officers talk about their military plans, where they were going, what type of weaponry they had. They spoke freely in there. And he would often send a note to his friend, Alexander Hamilton, by sewing a note into clothing he would make for him. He would then wrap it all up and have it delivered to Hamilton wherever he was. Mr. Hamilton, by then Captain Hamilton, and then Colonel Hamilton, would look in the clothes and find the notes from Hercules Mulligan. So throughout the war, Hercules Mulligan served as a spy for General Washington.
He was a very clever person.
He was jailed 3 times,
Yeah.
suspected of spying, but he was such a flamboyant character that he convinced the jury every time that it was a ridiculous idea and he was set free.
And did he was he known for getting his customers drunk in order to get that information?
I'm sure there was quite a lot of drinking going on, but
Yeah.
but during that time, the city was fully occupied and locked down by the British
Okay.
and operated as a military base. So I think they just felt very safe talking.
Yeah, let's move.
I think they just felt very safe
Yeah.
speaking freely about
Oh,
what was going on. And of course, you know, there were quite a few ladies in the town they would speak freely in front of too, who were members of that spy ring.
Callie, thank you again for another super chat. She just said she just bought your book. Amazing.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Alexander, thank you so much. Someone earlier asked, are the shoes comfortable?
They are now. When I first put them on,
And-
they were not because they're hard leather.
Men also wore those type of shoes, right?
Very similar shoes.
Similar,
The shoes
yeah.
were quite similar.
With the small heel.
Yes.
Let's see. Was where was Mulligan buried at, Spencer?
Where's Hercules Mulligan is buried not far from Alexander Hamilton in Trinity Graveyard.
You actually showed it to me in the live video. Yeah.
You know, at the end of the American Revolution, to make sure no one thought Hercules Mulligan really was a loyalist,
Yeah.
General Washington had breakfast with him right in his home, so
Oh.
that everyone would know he had served the Patriot cause.
Oh, fascinating. He did not want to make him a scapegoat.
Right.
Let's see.
And when President Washington was inaugurated not far from here on Wall Street,
Yeah.
he wore a suit made by Hercules Mulligan's shop, which meant that all of the gentlemen then went to Hercules Mulligan to have their clothes made if he was good enough for the president. Of course, he was
Fascinating.
good enough for everyone else. And he became a very wealthy man and later bought an estate on the East River that he retired to.
Is there remnants of his name in New York City?
I don't think there is there?
No,
There
I
isn't
never
anything
never seen the
like that,
Hercules
no.
Street or Mulligan Street.
There's McDougal Street and there's Willett's Point, Queens for Marinus Willett, another, hot-headed member of the New York Sons of Liberty. What else?
And Rosemary says hi. You're doing amazing storytelling. Many people are saying.
Thank you. So we're walking here along Pearl Street, which, of course, when this was the little Dutch colony of New Netherland, we would be walking along the shore. But,
Yeah.
by the time we became the colony of New York, there was already landfill to the left of us.
Oh,
in
interesting.
1695, the first landfill began here, and the island was filled out from where we are, 1 block to the left, Water Street, which we'll see at the next street. Looking up here, people can see why these are called concrete canyons.
Yes, we barely see sunlight, and it is a sunny day today.
And you can see how narrow the streets are and how tall the buildings are.
Did it feel like a canyon even during that era?
No, it felt very open then, I think.
Okay.
The buildings were only 1 to 2 stories high, so I believe it felt much more open at that time. And there was a lot of trees and greenery.
Was there width in the streets? Was it?
They were as wide as they are today.
Okay, that's
since
one.
this is a landmark
Let's see.
district, curb to curb, remains the distance that it was at that time. And since it is a landmark district, the streets also cannot be changed for development. So you see they still turn and they go up and down hill, and they take some very unusual twists and turns and paths and hills because they cannot be changed from their original layout. So when these skyscrapers were built here, many of them were built on very challenging landscapes. And actually the building to our right here, the end here, which is the second floor, at the other end of the building is the ground floor. Because it's built on a substantial
Whoa! I did not realize. Oh my god, it's so cool. So ground floor here on this street on Pearl, and then that leads to the ground floor down there on the second level.
If you cross this way,
So
you can see that the entrance up here is the second floor here. The ground floor here.
that's amazing. And Mark asks, where can people read about Hercules Mulligan?
You know, it's very difficult to find anything about Hercules Mulligan.
Okay.
I have some things that I've written about him on Facebook. You know, if you search the Patriot Tours Facebook page for Hercules Mulligan, you'll find some things. No one has really published anything about him. You sort of have to go back and look at the old first-hand accounts of what was going on. Although he was so important at the time, maybe because he didn't serve in the government and he didn't serve as an officer in the American Revolution, he's kind of left behind.
Is he covered in the television show Turn? And some greats.
Very briefly.
Watch out, some greats.
And I was very disappointed. He appeared briefly, and I thought they were going to incorporate a Hercules Mulligan theme.
Right, an entire storyline.
I think he appears briefly in season 3, and then he sort of disappears. So it was quite disappointing.
And someone just earlier asked, remind me who you were, did New York City at that time have a French Quarter? Were there Frenchmen here?
Not yet.
Okay.
That comes after the American Revolution, where New York really opens itself up to French refugees during the Revolutionary War.
Oh, Huguenots, right?
We did have French Huguenots first.
Okay, Huguenots.
A small group of them.
Yeah.
In my book about Theodosia Burr, I do talk about the French society here after the American Revolution, as Theodosia's best friend and adopted sister was a girl born at the Palace of Versailles, Natalie Delage, whose mother sent her here to America with her nanny to escape the French Revolution. Aaron Burr adopted her, and she grew up as a sister to Theodosia Burr. She married into the wealthy Sumter family of South Carolina. So I do talk about that. I talk about Madame de Senat's school here in New York. It was a French academy, and all of the fine families sent their children to that academy, including Alexander Hamilton sent his children to that academy. And I believe young scoundrel Washington Irving may have been expelled from it. Theodosia certainly went there. So after the American
Did they know each other?
They knew each other very well. And,
wow.
There was a rumor that Washington Irving was completely in love with Theodosia Burr.
I can imagine.
And that when she chose to marry the gentleman she married from South Carolina, that Washington Irving was so disappointed he never married a woman. And he did remain single. So
Just a side note, I could just imagine an alternate timeline where Washington did marry Theodosia and he ended up writing the definitive Aaron Burr story.
Well, you know what's interesting is
like a Hamilton, but back then for Burr.
Aaron Burr's closest friend, Matthew Davis, his closest friend and biographer, said that he believed that had Theodosia married Washington Irving, that Burr would have given up politics. Because Theodosia would have stayed in New York. Burr would have been a doting grandfather because his wife had passed away by then. Burr would have simply been a doting grandfather, and he wouldn't have cared about politics anymore, and our whole national history would have been different. Yeah.
All right, so now we are
The famous Wall Street and Pearl Street, or Wall and Queen Street, and we are standing right in front of what might have been in the 1790s. The Tontine Coffee.
Let's go this over here.
And some of you might know that the Tontine Coffee House is where Mr. Hamilton founded the Bank of New York in 1784. And that would have been the corner where we're standing here.
Ladies and gentlemen and people of all genders, our entire might was founded in a coffee house.
Everything was done in taverns and coffee houses,
Right.
right? The United States Marine Corps started in a tavern.
Oh, wow.
All of those famous, political pamphlets that you hear about from the Revolutionary War, all authored in coffee houses and taverns. So everything happened in coffee houses and taverns, and they were a little bit different. So over here, where this brick building is,
as opposed to like something like Joe and the Juice nowadays.
right.
Yeah.
Over there was the very well-known Merchant's Coffee House, which was also an auction house. And a place like the Merchant's Coffee House, you would have found men and women in there, eating, drinking, and socializing, going to auctions, talking, and planning. So you would see ladies like Mrs. Q in a place like the Merchant's Coffee House. However, there were also some taverns around the town where you would not have seen, let's say, ladies like Mrs. Q or ladies like Mrs. Hamilton or Miss Burr present. They would be a whole different type of ladies
Right.
in some of the taverns, right? So
hence why tea became popular in London. But interesting that women were also in coffee houses.
Very much so.
Upscale,
Yes.
normal women were in coffee
Yes,
houses.
and
Okay.
the Merchant's Coffee House especially. So you would have found many ladies like Mrs. Q socializing in the coffee houses, but not so much in the taverns, unless it was a private affair going on. But the gentlemen, of course, could freely frequent whichever places they would like to go because we had a bit of a double standard at the time.
And were Mrs. Q similar to women like Eliza Jumel who were involved in the money of their husband? Did they know about the ongoings?
Some were and some were not. Mrs. Q would be very involved. The story of Mrs. Q is that Mrs. Q was raised by her parents who were from Naples, Italy. And her father was a merchant from England who dealt with Italian imports who came to America, to New York. So her father was a sort of European merchant who owned a store not far from here in Hanover Square. Her mother was a dressmaker, a mantua maker, and her maiden name was C. And the C's only had two daughters, her older sister, who was very feminine and proper, and young Miss Q, or Miss C, who was much more of a tomboy of her time. And her father taught her his business.
Oh,
so when it came time to marry, he bequeathed the business to his daughter and her husband. So Mr. and Mrs. Q took over his import business here in New York City. So that is how she becomes a merchant. There is another lady merchant, Mrs. Alexander, whose son is William Alexander, Major General Lord Sterling, one of Washington's finest commanders. So there's also her. She is a lady merchant. And we mentioned Mrs. Montaigne, who owned the tavern by the Commons. So there are ladies in New York who are business ladies. There are ladies in New York who also help in their husbands' businesses behind the scenes. Mrs. Burr was very active in Mr. Burr's law business and often consulted with his clients and ran that business when he was away. So we do find ladies who are very active in New York in business, either right up front or behind the scenes with their husbands. Often to be successful in the American colonies, the husband and wife had to work together. And if you saw the HBO special on John Adams, you saw that Abigail was very active in John Adams' legal career, helping to advise him on his legal cases and listening to his arguments before he made them and advising him. So we see that here in America at that time. I think the ladies of that time are more involved and influential than we tend to think they were, looking back from our time. But when you go through and look at original source documents, you find that there are very many active ladies at that time. And here in New York especially, there were Dutch ladies who owned their businesses straight out, even through the English period.
Oh, fascinating. All right, so let's go on to the next stop.
Well, we should maybe talk about this Joe and the Juice.
Yeah.
Because if there's anyone watching who was a fan of the TV show Turn, Washington Spies, they know there was a coffee house run by a gentleman named James Rivington.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Who was also a loyalist printer here in New York City. His print shop was around the corner. And that there was a man who worked in this coffee house named Robert Townsend. He was from Oyster Bay, Long Island, and a Quaker. Quakers were neutral during the war, so he continued to live in New York during the British occupation, and he worked in Rivington's coffee house. He's also the gentleman known as Culper Jr., one of the
Yeah.
greatest spies of the American Revolution. So you can
fascinating.
kind of picture the gentleman at Mulligan's,
Yeah.
then coming over to
Yeah.
Rivington's Coffee House, being spied on in all of these locations. And they even said that at Mr. Rivington's Coffee House, they offered free breakfast to whomever had the best gossip of the night before.
Fascinating.
So you
I
can
love that.
see all of these places along here. This was a largely business district along here on
Yeah.
Pearl Street or Queen Street, with the British soldiers being spied on everywhere. They were of course spied on in the brothels and the taverns and the ladies in the theater, and they were spied on everywhere.
So they were officers that were hanging out here.
Yes.
Yeah. So they had.
High-ranking officers.
they had
The
intel.
commander was here. First, that would have been Commander Sir William Howe, then Commander Sir Henry Clinton, and then Commander Sir Guy Carleton, all in residence in New York during the Revolutionary War.
And Mags is amazed by your knowledge.
Thank you so much. If you ever come to New York once we reopen, I'll
Yeah.
be doing fully costume tours on weekends.
That's amazing.
We'll have lots of fun coming out and having Mrs. Q take you around the city.
And Sophia, thank you so much. Sophia says coffee for Karen. Yes.
Thank you, all of you.
And your guest is fabulous, says Sally. Oh, that's wonderful. And let's talk about let's talk about someone mentioned about so they went to coffee houses. They also went to taverns.
Yes.
Was there a lot kind of discussing military plans at taverns?
I think the officers probably did because they felt they were safe in there, and of course all of the, how would we call them, I don't want to use the modern term for them. Those ladies would have been
Right.
listening.
Ladies of the night.
And it is believed
Yeah.
that it possibly was a lady of that type who exposed Benedict Arnold's treason, because the person who was negotiating with Benedict Arnold was British Major John Andre, a very powerful officer here in New York, and it would have had to have been a woman who was very intimate with him to know that he was dealing with Benedict Arnold, for Benedict Arnold to come over to the British side and to perhaps help them capture Washington. So there were only a few women who were that close to John Andre, and one of the thoughts was it was one of the either theater or tavern ladies that he was intimate with who found this out and then passed on that information to the culprit spy ring.
So everyone, you think that House of Cards and Game of Thrones are scandalous? Real history.
It's very.
Sometimes it's
Oh.
as scandalous or more scandalous.
Watch Mrs. Q on Thursdays.
Oh, yes.
because Mrs. Q frequently brings up various scandals that are going on around New York City at that time that no one is supposed to know of, and occasionally you can hear Mr. Q admonish her from off camera that she is speaking too freely for a lady of her status.
So does everyone want to go to one more stop where Mrs. Q's location is at?
Oh, would you like to
Yeah.
know where Mrs. Q's shop was?
Let us know.
Is?
Let us know right now.
Let's go.
And any last remaining questions?
We'll go over to Hanover Square. Now, it seems fitting that this is Wall Street and that the financial district would all blossom here, because
Yeah.
this is pretty much from the 1600s through the 17 and 1800s where all the trading businesses were located in New York. So if we look to the left, we see a beautiful view of Brooklyn, but this was once a dock. And virtually all of these streets we see on our left were docks, as we were a seafaring business, right?
Yeah.
Oh, right up here on the right is where Captain Kidd lived.
Oh, fascinating.
Pirate Captain Kidd.
Can you tell us briefly his story? I'm very
William
curious.
Kidd
Yeah.
was a ship captain here in late 1600s New York, and he often went out on expeditions. And the way ship captains worked was gentlemen would get together and finance an expedition, or finance them to go out and buy goods and then bring them back. And on one of those expeditions William Kidd was on, things went very badly. His crew mutinied against him, and he wound up being tried for piracy. And he was ultimately hanged in England for piracy, I think around 1704. But piracy was rampant in colonial New York City. And right here, they say that right along here where we're standing on
Yeah.
Pearl Street that you would have seen pirates walking around freely with their guns and swords and their jewelry and everything, that it was so open in late 1600s New York that you would just see pirates just strolling around the area. They were like the celebrities of their time.
Yeah.
All of the ladies followed them. Everybody wanted to meet them and know them. So it was quite an interesting profession, and that it was practiced openly in New York and made quite a few people very wealthy, piracy.
Let me pause you right there. I want to mention something because we're talking a lot about spies from the American Revolution. Just last year, I did a video with two retired CIA officers. And they told me about the Starbucks right there at the corner that also has a spy story, but that's only from the 1990s. So it shows you like
Forever.
Things happen all the time here in New York City.
Both sides employed spies.
Not like Boston.
You know, one of the best spies for the English was a woman who was what they called a camp lady. And these are the ladies that followed Washington's camp. And she was from Philadelphia. She was a merchant, and she would set up and sell her goods around Washington's camps. She had a lovely personality. Everyone loved her and spoke to her.
Yeah.
And her father had been a military officer, and she had a photographic mind for weaponry.
Yeah.
And fully understood all types of weaponry. So she would walk through Washington's camps, and she would, in her mind, count the number of cannon they had, the number of men, how much ammunition they had, and report it back to the English. And she was really one of their best spies.
Oh, wow.
And let's go around to here.
So here's our last stop, Hanover
So now
Square.
we're in Hanover Square. And you might know that King George the First, Second, and Third were the Hanoverian kings of England. So
Yes.
it's originally named for them. And so the original shore was right over here at Pearl Street. But by the time Mrs. Q is in residence, there's one block of land more for Water Street. And all around Hanover Square are the loveliest shops in Colonial New York City. And since we're walking on a Saturday, I don't see any. But when you walk around the financial district, you'll notice that all the businesses have these beautiful flags with their corporate logos flying. That is a leftover from the colonial period, where people in New York who had shops flew a flag in front of their shop with their shop's logo on it, so that you could, as you were walking, easily find the store. So all of our finest shops are located around Hanover Square, and you would find Mr. and Mrs. Q right over here on the right, facing the square or the park, and many other lovely shops right around us, including Mr. Robert Townsend, Culper Jr.'s shop itself, I think, was over here. So all shopping districts through here.
Todd asked, is Sylvan Terrace in Washington Heights, is it related to this time of we're speaking?
It might be, and I don't know Upper Manhattan that well, because New York City literally was what we walked today.
Right.
So Upper Manhattan at that time, whoa, that's quite a ways in the country. You know, and everyone, of course, thought Mr. Hamilton had lost his mind when he built his country home, when he built the Grange all the way up there. Who wanted to be that far away?
So it might as well have been a different city on its own.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mr. Burr's country home was far enough away in the West Village.
And John Adams living at Lipston Meadow in modern-day Soho.
Wow. The country out in the woods there.
And let's see if we have any last questions. If you have any last remaining questions, feel free to ask. Do you make your own costume?
I do. I have made everything I have on today except my shoes and my stockings. So the stays, that foundational garment that laces up, I made those myself. I made the under dress, the chemise, which, since we're at the end, you can see here.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
And I'm cheating. Chemise. I do have some long underwear on, but don't tell. So this is my chemise. I made that. My stays. Let's see. Both petticoats and the jacket. So
that's amazing.
Whenever you see me dressed up, I'm wearing clothes I've made myself. And I have quite a few outfits. Every Thursday I wear a different outfit.
Oh, very cool.
I do.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I made the hat.
So the tour would be interesting. You might encounter a different costume.
Different costume, different hat.
And Prazen asks, are there any Dutch buildings in this immediate area?
There are none left here because there were, unfortunately, a series of fires that burned through this area.
And how about Mrs. Q's shop?
Mrs. Q's shop avoided both fires incredibly, but
Because Hanover Square was a bit spared because it was like
right,
the
it
place.
both went past.
Yeah.
The oldest building here today is the one there that was built in 1757. Mr. Q is trying to tell me something, but I don't know what.
So we're about to end. All right, Mr. Q. So thank you so much for taking us around, Karen. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for taking us around.
Thank you so much, everyone. And you can follow me at Patriot Tours NYC.
And Patriot Tours NYC, one more time, your PayPal, so anyone can give you a great tip.
PayPal.me/Patriot Tours.
Theodosia Burr's link is in the comments. Amazing book. And also, where can people book a tour?
PatriotToursNYC.com.
And then YouTube and Facebook, also search
Patriot Tours NYC.
There we go. Lots of great content.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking me around, all of us around. I absolutely love you bringing history to life.
Thank you.
It's amazing, mind-blowing tour. Highly recommend it. Everyone, keep being awesome and always keep on exploring.
Yes.
Have a good day, everyone. And let's do a wave goodbye. This way.
This way.
Bye-bye.
Bye.